software. Open source software is software that's freely available to use, redistribute, and modify. It's typically shared via a public code repository hosting service. So GitHub, for example, is one of those. GitLab is another one. Bitbucket is another one. And projects that are open source encourage a transparent process that is advanced through distributed peer review. Open source projects can be updated quickly and as needed and offer reliable and flexible software that is not built on locked proprietary systems. And thank you to Lynn Muldrow for this definition. And open source is really important because it's kind of the software that undergirds all of the software that we use and build upon as software developers. To get to Mars, right, the mini helicopter Ingenuity, that was built on top of open source software. Netflix has a whole open source arm, and there's a lot of the underlying software that powers things like Netflix, TikTok, etc. that is open source. And even the auto industry, which we may think of as more of a mechanical industry, is like increasingly fueled by software, and a lot of that is based on open source projects that are pulled in to proprietary software projects. So that graph that we looked at was at 10 million repositories in 2013. But as of this year, GitHub reports having over 83 million users and more than 200 million repositories. And they're not totally transparent about which ones are open source, but we know that at least 28 million of those repositories are open source public repositories that anybody can look at. If you're familiar with GitHub, GitHub also allows you to have private repos that are not open source and public. So one of the projects, let's see, sorry. Just want to make sure there are no questions. One of the projects that I've been, that I kind of started and am continue to kind of usher in people into open source is this Cloud Haiku project. This was the data from 2021. It is a project that you could, let's see. Oops. It's a project that you could find at this URL, which I could drop in the chat. And so this is a project that takes in haikus into a big public repository, and it shows this kind of front end website, and you could access all the haikus here. So this is just like a fun little project to try to get people to learn about the mechanics of doing a pull request. And this is what I'm going to walk through with you today. And it's been a project that I've been maintaining for quite a few years. There's been 2,700 forks of it, and it's a very popular project during Hacktoberfest, which is an annual celebration of open source software that happens during the month of October. So this is the repo that we talked through. And so what I want you to do, if you could do it now, or you could do it after this session, is to go to github.com and to create a user if you don't have one already. So I'm logged in, but you could go through the sign-in workshop, the sign-in workflow. If you happen to be a student or a teacher, it might be worth checking that box to get some special privileges through GitHub. GitHub offers quite a few packs for students and for teachers as well. The other thing that I would like you to do is download GitHub Desktop. And I will find that link for you. So it's desktop.github.com. And this is a graphical user interface that makes it's a little more user-friendly for beginners who are not so familiar with Git. But this is what I'm going to talk through for how to start your pull request with the Cloud Haiku repo. And yes, I think I'll pause for a few minutes and see if there's any questions right now. And if people want to set those up. Cool. So no questions right now? Okay. So this is what the GitHub desktop looks like. And if we go to Cloud Haiku, what I would want you to do is to create a fork of this repository into your GitHub user account. So the way that you would do this is you would fork it with this, this handy fork button. You would choose your, I already have a fork of it, but you would choose your username, or if you're associated with a organization, you could choose that. You could choose to keep, I would usually keep it as the same repository name, and then you would go ahead and create the fork. And what the fork would end up looking like is it would look like your username. So in my case, it's Tagliaferri, and then it's Cloud Haiku, and yours, I will sync my fork, but yours will be, since you're forking it now, should be exactly the same as what we would have on the upstream repo. So this is the upstream project. Then you'll have a project on GitHub. That's the project that's hosted by GitHub. And then what you would do from your fork is you would open that fork with GitHub Desktop. I'm going to, since I'm a maintainer on the project, I'm just going to pull it from here, but it's a good idea to pull it from your fork. And then you would go ahead and open that repo here, and then it will populate. Mine is already populated, but it will be populated here. And I'm going to stash the changes. Since I haven't updated my local repository in a while, I need to fetch from the origin. So are there any questions about this, or that I can walk through it again real quick? So first, what I would do is go to the project you want to contribute. In this case, we'll contribute to Cloud Haiku. We will fork this repo or repository. Repository is just where the code lives, and it lives on GitHub server somewhere. Then we would create the fork. The fork would live at our username / the Cloud Haiku project. Then we would do a code and open with GitHub Desktop and say open link. And then in this case, it would be the fork. And then mine is little, I have a few versions of this, but it should look something like this. You will have a local if you're on a Mac computer, it should be under Finder, Documents, GitHub, and then the repository name, and that's where you'll find all those files locally. But if you're working only with GitHub Desktop, then it should automatically be connected. Awesome. So I'm going to use Visual Studio Code, but I did learn that there's a cool little project within GitHub. So this is my fork. And if you press the period or stop, if you're British, button, the full stop button, you will get this VS Code kind of looking thing right on the web interface, which is kind of cool. And you could actually go through a pull request process this way. So you would see all the files just like how you would see them on GitHub, and you would actually be able to edit them if you wanted. But I'm going to show you with VS Code. So if you don't have Visual Studio Code, you could download it for free. If you have a different way of working with code, that's fine too. What we are going to do to contribute to this repo is we're going to submit a new haiku. And the haikus all live in this underscore haikus directory. The rest of the items that are here are some of the package pins, the configuration file, code of conduct license. We also have been lucky enough that people have translated a few of our README files. So if you're passionate about translation and foreign languages, then feel free to contribute in this way as well. What we want to do is just to create a new haiku file, and this is all, the whole project is in Jekyll, so it all kind of has a similar format. So we're just going to copy this general format. I could actually copy the whole thing. So you could choose any haiku and copy it, and just make sure that you're creating a new file under this haikus directory. And it looks like I need to refactor some things. And then we'll actually start with the number to make it easier to find. And we'll do Women Who Code Boston, December. And then it has to end in a .md for a markdown file. And then here is our file. And here is the kind of boilerplate that exists at the top of the file. So the layout, so it needs to have these 3 hyphens. And this is just a Jekyll thing. Jekyll is a static site generator that's written in Ruby on Rails, but a lot of the stuff you could work with in Markdown. So it has to have layout colon space haiku. We have the title, so we'll call it 2022 Women Who Code Boston December workshop. And then the author, put your name or whatever. And then we'd write the haiku, which is always challenging to do. So Women Who Code, so it's 575 Women Who Code now. In Boston this December. Our contribute. Okay, it doesn't totally make sense. But once we have that done, we do just do a file save just to make sure. And then I'm not sure with this. I think this is something that I need to fix as a maintainer, but we'll just fetch it again, make sure nothing weird is there. So this is our new haiku. So in the GitHub desktop, we see that we have this, we see what we added here. We see the changes we made. And then what we would do is just create a commit message, create a description, and then I actually want to create a new fork. Oops, where did it go? Okay, so this is the main branch. I'm actually going to create a new branch. So call it Women Who Code. Bring my changes. Okay, so now this on the new branch. And then I'm going to create this or whatever, add new poem. And then I will commit it. So the committing is basically kind of making sure it's in the right position to be brought into the repo. And then we're going to publish the fork. And then, publish the branch. So then this is my branch that's in here. And on your own fork of this, you would see a branch. If you wanted to commit to the main branch, that's okay too. With these kinds of things, it kind of depends on how your project works. So I would just read what the contributing file says for the project you're interested in. But then at this point, you could kind of follow this whole GitHub compare and pull request track that comes up. So we could say we're adding a new poem about Boston. We could say new haiku in haikus directory, and then we could create the pull request. And then I will have this button as a maintainer of this project, but for those of you who are not maintainers, you would just be able to create the pull request, and then a maintainer would be able to review it. And if everything looks good, they'll pull it in. If there's something that needs to be changed, then they could request changes instead, or create, make a comment or suggest things. And then at that point, if everything looks good, then things could be merged in. Our tests are failing, so don't worry about that right now. Would you like me to go through it again? Are there any questions about that workflow? No, we're all good. So just to kind of summarize it again, so what we did, we created a account on GitHub. GitHub is just one of the places where you can find open source repositories, but there's also GitLab, Bitbucket, and others. Then we download GitHub Desktop, and when you go to this desktop.github.com, it should initialize for whatever operating system you have. So it's definitely for Mac OS and Windows, and I believe there are some workarounds for Linux machines too. If you find that you're having a problem, just please feel free to ask me. Then we went to the repo that we wanted to work with. We created a fork of the repo in this case, and then we went to the code button and we opened it with GitHub Desktop. And then we made our changes with Visual Studio Code. We saw our changes in the GitHub Desktop, and then we committed it and then published the branch. So then when we are committing it, that's just all local changes, right? But so once we publish it to GitHub, that's when we know that it's actually something that we could use for somebody else. So somebody else can work with it. Cool. And I think, yeah, what's kind of important about the open source aspect of this is that, like, I know this is kind of like a project that's supposed to teach you how to do open source, but the idea behind open source is that the code that's on your machine is only useful for you, but when you're actually sharing it with others in like a bigger project, that's when that code is useful for other people, right? So for something like for something like a bigger project or a community project or a school project or whatever it is, it's always valuable to kind of commit early and often to these projects so that other people could use your code and keep working on it and improving it. Awesome. So Sigstore is one of the projects that I work on, which is relevant here because we have a tool that's called GitSign. So now I've been in the security space for about a year now, and something that's really interesting, like even is also very important in the open source ecosystem, is that anybody can contribute code to the internet, right? And we don't necessarily know where that code is coming from, but tools like Sigstore that enable software developers to sign their code makes it more obvious where that code is coming from, and it helps to make sure that we know where things are coming from. We're not just running code on our machines without thinking about it. And there's a few projects that have been adopting Sigstore for their packages. So PyPI, which is Python's package manager, is starting to enforce signing for some of the more vital packages of their ecosystem. NPM is also working on adopting Sigstore as well. And Kubernetes has adopted Sigstore so that releases are signed. So this can help to make sure that we know where code is coming from. And something that you could bring into your Git workflow is GitSign, which basically checks to make sure that you're signing your Git commit. So the commit, again, is when you're kind of staging the code into something that's going to become like a pull request. So you could sign your Git commit with this tool, and I could give you the the link. So this is the installation. It uses Go. And this allows you to sign things without using keys. So it'll kind of store short-lived keys on a certificate authority on your behalf. And you don't have to worry about keys, because I don't know if you've worked with like SSH keys or anything like that, but sometimes, you know, you go from computer to computer and it could be challenging to keep track of them. But this basically just enables you to add this flag of S to sign Git commits if you're working on the command line. I think they're still working on some of the graphical user interface applications of this, but it's a cool tool if you're working with open source software, and Sigstore itself is also open source. And if you're interested in, I find the community to be very nice, and it's distributed across academia and industry. Like there's people from Red Hat, Google, NYU who are involved with this. And they also have, if you do Go development or anything like that, there's lots of issues that are labeled as good first issues for newcomers. And I am the maintainer of the docs page, which is what I was just showing you here. And we have, if you're interested in getting your feet wet in open source, sometimes docs are they're hard to do for sure, but they might be like a way to kind of get involved in a community when you're trying to use a tool like GetSign, for example, and see that the docs could be improved. This is a way to get involved. And we have a bunch of open issues here and a bunch of open issues in the cosign project, which is the signature for software artifacts. Also, I shared those. But I want us to also say that open source is not just about code contributions. Open source is something that we could use all kinds of talent in, right? So event planning is a big part of open source, like hackathons, obviously, but just kind of sharing resources with each other, like the work that Women Who Code does and Anna does is very awesome work and very important to improve the open source ecosystem and also like increase diversity in the ecosystem. People who have a background in design is all like, that's great and is also useful in open source, like projects, you know, like the 6R project, right, has these like logos, and those are important contributions. Writing documentation, but also writing tutorials, writing translations of the README files, for example, are very valuable, and they also help increase equity within open source so that more people can understand what a software tool does. They can understand how to contribute. Here are also some different projects that are for beginners who want to start working in open source. Hopefully they're all still live. So there's first contributions. This is kind of a big list, and I'll share the slide deck once I'm done. Yeah, awesome for beginners, up for grabs, awesome for non-programmers, so people who may not want to do a code contribution to begin with. There's a lot of resources there. Oops. Awesome. I think I would love to take questions, and I could also go back and let me actually share this project with you. So that's the full slide deck with all the resources. I could also, if folks are pretty new to GitHub, I could also give a walkthrough of all the, like, I know Git has a lot of different terms. So I'm happy to kind of give a overview too, because I do have slides about this too. But are there any questions about pull requests or anything you want me to show you again? I will do a slideshow of this. Okay, so Git in general, it's version control, right? So Git itself is an open source tool, and it's totally you could work all exclusively on the command line, and it's not GitHub's project. It's an older project, very tied to the Linux ecosystem. But Git itself is free and open source, and it is what kind of undergirds these big code hosting platforms like GitHub, and it basically allows for tracking changes across files and is used for collaboration across software development projects. So part of my background is in the digital humanities, so this has a digital humanities example, but basically if you find a project you want to contribute to, maybe it's called DH-Lab/DH project, for example, that would be the repo that you would find. Here I am, I want to contribute to this project. And then what we did, right, with the Cloud Haiku project is we created a fork of that original project, and now we have my GitHub DH project fork. So it's basically like just a total copy of that project, but it exists as something that I could work with. And what we call the main project that we found in the wild is called Upstream, and what we call our project that we forked is called the origin, right? That's what exists on GitHub in their cloud servers. And then we make a local copy, right? We clone that repo, and that lives on our laptop or whatever. And all of this, the gray part, all lives on GitHub servers. And then the local copy of the Digital Humanities project is totally inherited from the remote Upstream copy, and there's a main branch. There was a big move from moving to the name of main branch from master branch a few years ago, just to make it more equitable. And as I mentioned, different projects have different approaches to branches, so you kind of want to kind of scope out what it's like at a project you would interested in contributing to. I like to use branches for like lots of different things. So like if I'm doing a few different changes to something at once, I might have all these different branches and kind of switch between them to make it easier for me to understand where different things are and to keep things discrete. But you may only have a branch per like a release, right? So if you're doing a lot of work at once, it might all be on one branch, and then you would open a pull request. So it kind of depends on your workflow and the workflow of the project. But the main branch is basically the one that's the important branch that's serving the software, and then any other branches that are underneath that will be where you would keep your contributions discrete. So say you're like in this example, like say this is a digital archive and you're adding like PDFs of manuscripts to the archive. So each commit would be like each commit is something new that you're adding, and you could add a lot of things at once into one commit, but a commit is basically a snapshot. It's like a moment in time. So if you're adding a few different like Python files, it could all be in one commit, or you could add one Python file at a time, depending on how you're working and how the project works. In this case, like say it's two different PDFs and they committed it for one and committed it for the second one, and then those are both on that same branch. At this point, once they're satisfied with all the changes they made, then they could push it to their origin, which is where my GitHub version of that project is. So now it's going from my local computer to the cloud GitHub, right, to their website. And then like we did with the haiku, we open a new pull request. We're adding these materials there. We said where we added them and why. And basically, what does this look like? Basically, the person who's contributing is requesting that the Upstream project pull in those changes they made. So that's what a pull request is. In GitLab, they call it a merge request. So they're requesting for the merge. It's kind of, yeah, different semantics, but it's basically like requesting the project makes a change based on the changes that the individual contributor created. So at this point, the maintainers, which are in the upstream project, are going to review and test the code on this branch. So this is the branch that there was a pull request to merge those changes into the main project so that they would be part of the main branch. But this time, the maintainer's job is to review and test the code. They may ask for changes. They may ask for things to be done a certain way. Like, so if it's, if they may ask like Python code to be linted, for example, if it's not following their style. They may ask for commits to be squashed sometimes so that so if you're making a lot of commits, each commit kind of has its own metadata. They may want it all to be like one commit all at once. So there might be a little bit of back and forth, but once everybody is happy, they think it's a valuable contribution, they will accept that pull request and merge it in, which is an exciting moment. And then at this point, this project, the main upstream project, has been updated. So any other fork of that project will have to fetch because there's going to be changes that have been made. So this, it's not always like an important change, right? But if it's like a security change, then that might be more important that they make sure that they're pulling in any kind of breaking change, any kind of security change, because it might change how you're contributing to that project. In which case, like you would have to refactor your code like during a pull request kind of back and forth if you're not up to date. So it's a good idea in your GitHub desktop to kind of fetch often, make sure you're fetching from the main branch and fetching and making sure that your local copy is up to date so that any breaking changes that have happened aren't going to impact you. Oops, I wasn't sharing this, was I? Sorry. Yeah, so just the GitHub desktop, I would just, yeah, so I was on this branch, and then I moved to the main branch, and then I fetched the origin. It's just a good idea to keep fetching as you're working so that you're not having problems by working off of code that is outdated. Also, are there any questions, anything I could help with? Did anybody try to go through the pull request workflow that might need troubleshooting or anything?
Hello, I just unmuted myself. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes.
Oh, the question I had was, I was interested in contributing to open source, and something you said at the beginning reminded me of why I never did it is that, like you said, there's just thousands of repos, and I didn't know if you had advice on like just finding an appropriate project to start on.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think so. The best advice I have for that is to kind of think about what projects are you using, and when you're working on something, like if you're working in Python, for example, and you are using like a library, like maybe it's like NumPy or whatever it is, and you notice that like, oh, I wish there was this feature available, or I found the documentation really confusing, but I was able to solve it. Kind of those little things where you kind of notice a bit of friction, that might be a good moment to look and see if you could find the original repo for the package that or dependency that you're using, and see if there is something that you could contribute to it. Another thing is a lot of open source projects have weekly or bi-weekly meetings. So if there's like a tool that you use frequently, or something you use at work or school, you may want to look and see if you could find the website that kind of explains something about their open source project. And if they do regular meetings, like I know for it's going to depend a lot on the project, right? Because some projects are really small and some are really big. So something like Python, there's tons of different committees there, but there's often like opportunities to get involved and just kind of whatever ecosystem you're interested in, just trying to see where where are the people that are contributing to that? Like, where do they lurk, and how can you kind of see how do they govern themselves, and how are they holding meetings? How are they communicating? That would be kind of the original, like the first place I would look. And let me see if I could find this resource. One of my former colleagues kind of gave a bunch of resources on contributing to open source. And let me see if I could. So this is a big tutorial series about open source. And I thought there was one that was a little more specific to contributing. But I could also continue to look for that. But does that give you like an initial idea? Or are there any communities you're specifically interested in?
Yeah, I do work more in Java, but I know there's OpenJDK now. I don't know. That is a good idea to try to find something that you do use already. So that, yeah, that does give me a good idea of it, because I just basically went in and typed in Java looking for Java projects, and there were just so many. So yeah, that's a good idea. If you were interested in something like serverless or yeah, I guess I just had to play around on GitHub, I think, and just poke around.
Yeah, my understanding was that GitHub also has like a discovery, like is it Explore maybe? That lets you, if you go onto your GitHub and you search and you click on Explore, then it should surface some things that are related to some of the projects that you may be contributing to already or working in. The other thing, I know Sixstore itself has a Java project where they are they're doing some work in like keyless signing and verification in Java. And I know the people working on it, they're really great. So they have like I think weekly or bi-weekly meetings about Sixstore Java. So that might be a place where I know that the people are, they're welcoming. So I dropped it in the chat.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, that's actually a really good idea. I was not aware that people met, about this stuff. So that's really good thing to know. Thank you.
Yeah, there's lots of I mean, it really depends on the project for sure. Every project's different. Awesome. Are there any other questions?
I was going to say that up for grabs site you shared earlier. I forget if you mentioned it just now, but that also looks really useful.
Yeah, I think I put it in the chat, the whole presentation, but I could put those links into yeah, so there's first timers only for people just beginning with open source. There is up for grabs. There's awesome for beginners, and there's awesome for non-programmers. And usually for Hacktoberfest, every year they will usually spotlight a few different repositories as well. Awesome. I'm glad somebody contributed a PR. I will review them after we're done. Any other questions right now? Awesome. If anything comes up, I think I put my, if people are leaving Twitter, but I put my, this is my Twitter. My email is my full name at gmail.com. The tests on that are not, they're not working quite right, but it's supposed to be testing the syllables and that the markdown is following the that boilerplate that's at the top of the Jekyll file. But they are failing. Yes, they need to be fixed. I think it's because it's testing the entire repo and there's some things were contributed that weren't working. It is an opportunity to start contributing, yes. If you love GitHub Actions. Yeah, I could show you that file in GitHub. So it's a GitHub action. That uses this test.js file. And the GitHub action is under the .github workflows. And GitHub has a few different security features which are good, but it's not super lenient for a project like this where we're trying to get newcomers to the project. It's more for their security is more for people who are, working with people they know to be contributing there. So we had to make some changes to it, and then so it's kind of checking against the whole repo, which is not ideal, but awesome. Are there no other questions right now? Cool. I'll hand it back to you, Anna, then.
Sounds great. Thank you, Lisa. I'll stop the recording.